8 months pregnant, slapped in court by her husband's mistress. What happened next exposed murder, revealed the judge was her father, and destroyed a criminal empire. The slap wasn't random. It was checkmate in a 3-year game orchestrated by a killer so dangerous even Russian assassins feared her. If you're ready for a story that proves truth really is stranger than fiction, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about trust, family, and survival forever. This is Sarah's story, and it starts with a lie that took 28 years to uncover. The marble floors of Manhattan Family Court echoed with the sound of expensive heels. Sarah Chen Parker adjusted her maternity dress one final time, her 8-month pregnant belly making even simple movements feel monumental. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fighting for survival in a courthouse where justice was supposed to be guaranteed. 6 months ago, she'd been living in a $50 million penthouse, planning nursery designs and baby showers. Now she was staying in a women's shelter, counting every dollar, preparing to face the man who'd systematically destroyed her life. "Remember," Marcus Webb whispered beside her, "he's going to try to provoke you. That's what narcissists do when they're losing control." Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled. Marcus had taken her case pro bono after seeing the security footage she'd secretly commissioned, the footage that showed everything. "Mrs. Chen Parker." The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts. "Court is ready for you." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate. That made it worse somehow. Across the aisle sat Michael Richardson, still devastatingly handsome in his custom Italian suit. Beside him, Veronica Sterling wore a dress that cost more than most people's cars. She shouldn't have been there at all, but Rich's team of lawyers had somehow gotten her classified as a financial consultant. Judge Harrison Matthews presided, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing gray eyes. Sarah had researched him extensively, fair but strict, with a reputation for cutting through legal games. She prayed that would work in her favor. "This is a hearing to determine temporary support and custody arrangements," Judge Matthews announced. "Mr. Richardson, your wife is 8 months pregnant and claims you've cut off all financial support." Rich's lead attorney, Charles Blackstone, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client discovered evidence of adultery. Under the prenuptial agreement, Mrs. Chen Parker forfeits all claims to support if she's been unfaithful." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She looked at Marcus, whose face had gone pale. This wasn't in any of their preparation. "We'd like to present evidence," Blackstone continued, producing a tablet. On the screen were photos that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Images of her with another man, clearly intimate, clearly fake, but expertly crafted. "These are fabricated," Marcus objected, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have digital forensics experts who can testify to their authenticity," Blackstone replied smoothly. Sarah watched her life collapse in real time. The photos were impossible to disprove quickly, and Rich knew it. She caught him smirking at her from across the room, and in that moment, she saw him clearly for the first time. Not charming or successful or magnetic, just cruel. Judge Matthews studied the images, his expression unreadable. "This evidence will need to be properly authenticated. However, given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm inclined to suspend temporary support pending full investigation." "Your Honor," Marcus tried desperately, "my client is homeless and 8 months pregnant." "Perhaps she should have considered that before her extramarital activities," Veronica said loudly, earning a sharp look from the judge. Sarah felt the baby kick frantically, responding to her spiking blood pressure. The walls seemed to be closing in. Rich had planned this perfectly. Even if she eventually proved the photos were fake, The process would take months. Months she didn't have. "I need a brief recess," she whispered to Marcus, but as she tried to stand, pain shot through her lower back. That's when everything changed. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had been sitting in Dr. Amanda Foster's office, trying to explain why she'd hired a private investigator to follow her own husband. "It started with small things," Sarah said, one hand resting on her belly. Money disappearing from accounts. Phone calls he'd take in private. The way he'd watch me sometimes, like he was calculating something. Dr. Foster leaned forward. She specialized in narcissistic abuse and had seen the patterns before. "What made you decide to investigate his second wife's death?" Sarah's voice barely a whisper. "Caroline Richardson. She died 18 months ago. Fell down the stairs while pregnant, lost the baby, then committed suicide a week later. That must have been traumatic for your husband." "That's what I thought, but he never talked about it, never grieved, and when I got pregnant, he seemed almost angry, not disappointed, angry." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Dr. Foster a text chain. "I found these conversations with someone named V. They were talking about Caroline like she was a problem that got solved." Dr. Foster read carefully, her expression growing concerned. "Sarah, these messages suggest your husband might be dangerous. Have you considered that Caroline's death might not have been accidental?" The question hung in the air like poison. Sarah had considered it, late at night when Rich was working and she was alone with her fears. But thinking it and hearing it spoken aloud were different things entirely. "I hired Detective Jim Morrison," Sarah continued. "Retired NYPD, now does private work. He found security footage from the building across from our old penthouse. Footage from the night Caroline died." Dr. Foster's eyes widened. "What did it show?" "Rich and Veronica on our balcony. Caroline was there too, but she was backing away, looking terrified. Then the camera angle changes, and when it comes back, Caroline's gone and Rich is calling 911, hysterical about his wife's accident." "You said Veronica. Is that the same V from the text messages?" Sarah nodded. "Veronica Sterling. High-end escort, though she calls herself a consultant now. She specializes in wealthy men going through divorces. Helps them hide assets, discredit wives, whatever it takes." "Sarah," Dr. Foster said carefully, "you need to go to the police immediately." "I can't. Detective Morrison tried to enhance the footage, but it's not clear enough for a criminal case. All we can see is that Caroline was on the balcony with them before she died. Rich's lawyers would tear it apart. But it's evidence of his character, his pattern of behavior, which is why I'm using it in the divorce. If I can prove he's been planning to get rid of me the same way he got rid of Caroline, the prenup becomes void due to fraud and coercion." Dr. Foster shook her head. "This is incredibly dangerous. Sarah, if you're right about what happened to Caroline, you're putting yourself at enormous risk." "I'm already at risk," Sarah replied, feeling the baby kick as if in agreement. "He's cutting off my access to everything. Credit cards, bank accounts, even my phone plan. He's isolating me, just like he did to Caroline." "What about family friends who could help?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Rich made sure I cut ties with everyone over the past 3 years. Said they were jealous of our happiness, that they didn't understand our love. I believed him because I wanted to." This was the universal dilemma that would resonate with viewers. How many people had made similar choices, prioritizing a relationship over their support network, only to realize too late they were being systematically isolated? "The only person I have left is my adoptive father, David Parker, but he's a family court judge. He can't help me without compromising his position." Dr. Foster made notes, her concern evident. Sarah, I want you to promise me something. If you feel unsafe at any point, you'll call me immediately, day or night. I promise. But even as Sarah said the words, she wondered if she'd have the chance to keep that promise. Rich was getting more volatile, more controlling. Just that morning, he'd stood in their bedroom doorway watching her dress, his expression calculating. You're not really thinking of going through with this divorce, are you, darling? He'd said, his voice deceptively gentle. Think about what you're giving up. Think about what could happen to someone in your condition if they suddenly found themselves alone in the world. The threat was clear, even wrapped in concern. Sarah had learned to read the subtext in everything Rich said. He was planning something, and she was running out of time to stop it. As she left Dr. Sard Foster's office that day, Sarah made a decision. She would plant a recording device in Rich's home office. If he was planning to hurt her, she needed proof, real, undeniable evidence that could save her life and her baby's. She had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. Detective Jim Morrison's office looked like something from a 1980s cop show. Cigarette burns on the desk, coffee-stained files, and a wall covered with photos of missing persons and cold cases. But his reputation was solid, and more importantly, he'd agreed to work for the small retainer Sarah could afford. The recording device worked, Morrison said, sliding a laptop across his desk. Your husband had several interesting conversations after you planted it. Sarah's heart pounded as Morrison played the first recording. Rich's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The same exit strategy we used for Caroline, Rich was saying. Sarah's getting suspicious, asking too many questions about the accounts. We need to move the timeline up. Veronica's voice responded, sultry and calculating. The pregnancy complicates things. Can't make it look like an accident if she's that far along. Leave that to me. I've been documenting her emotional instability. Postpartum depression that started early. She's been talking about suicide. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. She'd never said anything about suicide. Ever. That's clever, Veronica purred. Pregnant woman, husband having affair, financial stress. Very believable. Morrison paused the recording. There's more, but it gets worse. The next segment made Sarah physically sick. Rich and Veronica discussing life insurance policies, how to access Sarah's accounts after her death, even plans for raising the baby with Veronica as stepmother. They're planning to kill me, Sarah whispered, the reality hitting her like a physical blow. It gets complicated, Morrison said grimly, because technically, this is conspiracy to commit murder. But proving intent is tricky, and your husband's too smart to say anything explicitly incriminating. What do you mean? Morrison played another segment. Rich's voice was careful, almost rehearsed. I want the problem solved, permanently. But I can't know the details. Complete deniability. He's done this before, Sarah realized. With Caroline. That's what I think too. But here's where it gets interesting. Morrison pulled out a thick file. I've been digging into Veronica Sterling's background. She's not just some escort who got lucky. She's a professional. Professional what? Professional widowmaker. Real name is Victoria Stone. She's been linked to at least 4 wealthy men whose wives died under suspicious circumstances. Each time, she disappears with a substantial payout, then resurfaces with a new identity. Sarah felt the room spinning. How is she not in prison? Because she's careful, never leaves direct evidence, always has alibis, and she chooses her marks well. Men with secrets, men who can't afford scrutiny. Like Rich. Exactly. Your husband has been laundering money for some very dangerous people. Russian mob, cartel money, corporate bribes. If that comes out, he goes to prison for life. Veronica probably has evidence of all of it. Sarah's mind raced. So they're using each other. Right. She helps him eliminate inconvenient wives. He helps her disappear when things get hot. Perfect partnership until someone gets greedy or careless. Morrison pulled out surveillance photos of Rich and Veronica entering various buildings, meeting with suspicious characters, conducting business that clearly wasn't legal. The good news is, we have enough evidence to destroy him in divorce court and probably put him away criminally. The bad news is, if he realizes what we know, you're in immediate danger. Sarah looked at the photos, the recordings, the documented evidence of her husband's crimes. She'd married a monster, but worse, she'd married a monster who was planning to kill her. What do? We go to court, present everything, and pray the system works fast enough to save your life. But Morrison's expression suggested he wasn't confident about that timeline. Sarah left his office with a flash drive full of evidence and a growing certainty that she was racing against a clock she couldn't see. That night, as Rich worked late in his office, Sarah lay in bed feeling the baby move restlessly. She placed her hands on her belly and whispered, "Don't worry, little one. Mommy's going to protect us both." She had no idea that Rich was in his office at that very moment, finalizing plans that would make her protection impossible. The morning of the hearing, Sarah woke to find Rich gone and a note on her nightstand. "Taking care of some business. See you in court. Remember what we discussed about cooperation?" The threat was clear. Sarah called Marcus immediately. "He knows something," she said, pacing her hotel room. She'd moved out of the penthouse the night before, using the last of her credit to pay for a cheap room near the courthouse. "The evidence is solid," Marcus assured her. "Morrison's recordings are admissible. We have financial documents showing the money laundering. We're going to destroy him." But as Sarah entered the courtroom, she noticed things that made her stomach clench. Rich looked too confident, too relaxed. Veronica sat in the gallery wearing a smug expression that suggested she knew something Sarah didn't. Judge Matthews called the hearing to order. "Mrs. Chen Parker, you've made serious allegations against your husband. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Marcus stood confidently. "Your Honor, we have recordings of the defendant discussing plans to murder my client, evidence of financial crimes, and documentation of a pattern of eliminating inconvenient wives." He moved to play the first recording, but nothing came out of the speakers except static. Sarah's heart stopped. Marcus tried again, his face growing pale. The recordings were corrupted, unplayable. "Technical difficulties, Your Honor," Blackstone said smoothly. "Perhaps we should move on to more reliable evidence." Sarah watched in horror as Marcus tried desperately to salvage their case. The financial documents were dismissed as hearsay. The surveillance photos were ruled inadmissible due to privacy violations. One by one, every piece of evidence they'd gathered was systematically destroyed. "Your Honor," Marcus said desperately, "someone has tampered with our evidence." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb," Judge Matthews replied. "Do you have proof of tampering?" Marcus looked at Sarah helplessly. They both knew what had happened, but proving it was impossible. "Move to dismiss," Blackstone said triumphantly. "My client has been subjected to false accusations based on fabricated evidence." Sarah felt the world tilting. The baby kicked frantically as her blood pressure spiked. This couldn't be happening. They'd had everything they needed to destroy Rich, and somehow he'd turned it all against her. "Furthermore," Blackstone continued, producing his own tablet, "we have evidence that Mrs. Chen Parker has been unfaithful to her marriage vows." The photos appeared on the courtroom screen. Sarah with another man. Clearly intimate, clearly damning. They were perfect fakes, but perfect enough to destroy her. These photos were taken by a private investigator my client hired after becoming suspicious of his wife's behavior, Blackstone explained. Sarah tried to speak, but no words came. The images looked real. If she didn't know better, she'd believe them herself. Given the evidence of adultery, Judge Matthews said slowly, I have no choice but to enforce the prenuptial agreement. Mrs. Chen Parker, you forfeit all claims to marital assets. Your Honor, Marcus pleaded, my client is homeless and 8 months pregnant. Perhaps she should have considered that before her extramarital activities, Rich said quietly, his voice carrying just enough manufactured hurt to sound believable. Sarah's vision blurred. The baby was moving frantically now, and she could feel her body going into distress. She'd lost everything. The evidence that could have saved her was gone, replaced by lies so perfect they might as well have been truth. As court adjourned, Rich approached her with Veronica at his side. I tried to warn you, darling, he said softly, so only she could hear. Cooperation would have been so much easier. Now things are going to get unpleasant. Veronica smiled. Her red lips curved in cruel satisfaction. Don't take it personally, sweetie. It's just business. Sarah sank into her chair as they walked away, their laughter echoing in the empty courtroom. She'd played right into their hands, and now she was completely at their mercy. The baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp. At least she still had that. As long as she was alive, she could protect her child. She had no idea that Rich was already making arrangements to take even that away from her. 2 days after the devastating court hearing, Marcus Webb burst into Sarah's hotel room with news that made her heart race. I found something, he said, spreading documents across the small table. Rich made a mistake, a big one. Sarah, exhausted from sleepless nights and constant worry, looked up from where she sat, feeding crackers to her growling stomach. The prenup might have cut off her access to money, but it couldn't stop her from fighting. What kind of mistake? The offshore accounts. He had to disclose them to create those fake adultery photos. His tech team needed to show financial motivation for your supposed affair. But in doing that, they revealed accounts he never declared in discovery. Sarah's hopes began to rise. How much money are we talking about? 12 million. Hidden in Cayman Islands, shells companies. If we can prove he committed perjury by hiding assets, the entire prenup becomes void due to fraud. For the first time in days, Sarah felt like she could breathe. Can we prove it? Already did. I have a contact at Treasury who owed me a favor. The paper trail is clear as day. Marcus filed an emergency motion that afternoon. Within hours, they were back in Judge Matthews' courtroom. This time, Sarah felt the tide turning in her favor. Mr. Richardson, Judge Matthews said sternly, these documents suggest you've hidden substantial assets from the court. Do you have an explanation? Rich's confidence flickered for the first time. Blackstone whispered urgently in his ear before standing. Your Honor, these accounts are business investments, completely separate from marital assets. Business investments that your client failed to disclose, Marcus countered, under oath. Judge Matthews reviewed the financial records, his expression growing darker. Mr. Richardson, I'm freezing all accounts pending full investigation. Mrs. Chen Parker, you'll receive temporary support of $50,000 per month until this matter is resolved. Sarah nearly cried with relief. $50,000 would cover the hotel, food, medical care. She was safe, at least temporarily. But as they left the courthouse, Marcus pulled her aside. "Don't get too comfortable. Rich is going to appeal this, and he has resources we can't match. This buys us time, but not much." That night, Sarah allowed herself the luxury of ordering room service and calling Dr. Foster with the good news. For the first time in months, she felt like she might actually survive this. She was unpacking the few belongings she'd managed to take from the penthouse when she found it. Hidden in her jewelry box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small device she didn't recognize. A tracking device. Rich had been monitoring her movements the entire time. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized the implications. He knew about Dr. Foster. He knew about Detective Morrison. He knew about Marcus's treasury contact. Her phone rang. Rich's number. "Hello, darling." His voice was silk over steel. "Found my little gift. Did you? You've been tracking me. I've been protecting my investment. You see, Sarah, I know about every move you've made, every person you've talked to, every piece of evidence you think you have." Sarah's hand shook. "The recordings were real. You and Veronica planning to kill me." Rich laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Were they? Technology is amazing these days. You can make anyone say anything if you're clever enough." "You're lying." "I might check your laptop. Darling, the real recordings are quite different." Sarah opened her computer with trembling fingers. Morrison's files had been replaced. In the new versions, the voices were clearly different. The conversations, innocuous business discussions. "You see," Rich continued over the phone, "I've been very patient with you, allowing you to think you were investigating me, letting you build your little case. It's been quite entertaining. The treasury contact works for me now. Amazing what 50 million in cryptocurrency can buy, including federal investigators with gambling debts." Sarah sank onto the bed, the full scope of Rich's manipulation becoming clear. He'd allowed her to think she was building a case against him while he was actually building a trap around her. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I need a clean exit. Darling, the Russians are getting impatient about their money, and the FBI is getting too close to my business operations. A grieving widower with a tragic story gets much more sympathy than a man who abandons his pregnant wife. I'll go to the police directly. With what evidence everything you think you have is fabricated, and after tomorrow's hearing, you'll be declared mentally unstable and unfit to raise a child." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, finally understanding the true depth of her situation. Rich hadn't just been planning to kill her, he'd been planning to discredit her so thoroughly that no one would question her death. She was 8 months pregnant, alone, broke, and completely at the mercy of a man who'd already killed once. The baby kicked, and Sarah placed her hands protectively over her belly. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered. "Mommy tried to protect us, but I wasn't smart enough." Outside her hotel window, the city glittered with millions of lights, each one representing someone who would never know her story, never know how close evil had come to winning. The next morning's hearing began with Sarah's worst fears coming true. Blackstone presented a psychiatric evaluation she'd never undergone, documenting severe depression and suicidal ideation. Dr. Richard Steinberg examined Mrs. Chen Parker extensively, Blackstone announced. His professional opinion is that she poses a danger to herself and her unborn child. Sarah had never met Dr. Steinberg, but his credentials were impeccable and his testimony devastating. On paper, she was a woman who'd lost touch with reality, making increasingly desperate accusations against her loving husband. The defendant's behavior has become erratic, Dr. Steinberg testified via video link. She's exhibiting classic signs of prenatal psychosis, including paranoid delusions about her husband's fidelity and business practices. Marcus fought valiantly, but without evidence to contradict the psychiatric report, he was powerless. Judge Matthews, bound by law and medical opinion, had no choice but to order a competency evaluation. Mrs. Chen Parker will be remanded to Bellevue for 72-hour observation, the judge announced. The child will be placed in protective custody immediately upon birth. Sarah's world shattered completely. Not only was she losing her husband and her security, but they were going to take her baby. Rich had found the perfect weapon against her. As the bailiffs approached to escort her out, Sarah felt something inside her break. This was the second devastating peak, worse than the first because she'd allowed herself to hope. "Wait," she called out desperately. "I have something to say." Judge Matthews looked reluctant but nodded. "Proceed, Mrs. Chen Parker, but make it brief." Sarah stood, her entire body shaking. This was her last chance to tell the truth, even if no one would believe her. "My husband is planning to murder me," she said clearly. "Just like he murdered Caroline Richardson. I have evidence." The courtroom erupted. Blackstone objected furiously, but Sarah continued. "I know how this sounds, but I'm not crazy. I'm not delusional. I'm a woman fighting for her life and her baby's life against a man who's already killed once and is planning to kill again." She looked directly at Rich, who maintained his expression of pained concern perfectly. "You almost had me believing I was losing my mind, but I remember everything, every threat, every manipulation, every time you made me feel like I was worthless." "Your Honor," Blackstone interrupted, "this outburst clearly demonstrates my client's wife's deteriorating mental state." But something in Sarah's voice, some core of truth beneath the desperation, made Judge Matthews pause. "Mrs. Chen Parker, do you have any current evidence to support these allegations?" Sarah's heart sank. "No, Your Honor. He destroyed it all." "Then I'm afraid my ruling stands." As the bailiffs reached for her, the unthinkable happened. Veronica Sterling stood up in the gallery. "Actually, Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She's absolutely right." The courtroom fell silent. Rich's face went white. "Miss Sterling," Judge Matthews said carefully, "you're not sworn in. You can't testify." "Then swear me in," Veronica replied, walking toward the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd just decided to burn everything down. "Because I have a lot to say about Richard Richardson's business practices." Rich jumped to his feet. "She's lying. She's unstable. Don't listen to her." But Veronica was already raising her right hand, and Sarah saw something in the other woman's eyes she'd never expected to see: fear. "Miss Sterling," Judge Matthews said slowly, "are you prepared to testify under oath about the matters Mrs. Chen Parker has alleged?" "I am, Your Honor, including the murder of Caroline Richardson and the planned murder of Sarah Chen Parker." Rich's careful composure finally cracked. "You bitch," he snarled. "After everything I've done for you. Everything you've done for me." Veronica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean like planning to frame me for Sarah's murder? Like setting up those Russian accounts in my name so when the FBI comes looking, I take the fall instead of you?" Sarah watched in amazement as her tormentors turned on each other. Rich lunged toward Veronica, but bailiffs restrained him. "She's lying," he screamed. "She killed Caroline. She's obsessed with me." "Prove it," Veronica said coldly, pulling a small device from her purse. "Because unlike you, Richard, I actually plan ahead." The device was a digital recorder, and as Veronica played the first file, Sarah heard her husband's voice clearly planning her murder, down to the smallest detail. The second devastating peek had become her salvation. But Sarah could see in Rich's eyes that this was far from over. Veronica's testimony unraveled Rich's entire operation, but it came at a price that Sarah couldn't have anticipated. As the escort-turned-whistleblower detailed years of murders, money laundering, and manipulation, Sarah felt the stress triggering something wrong in her body. "I met Richard 3 years ago," Veronica testified, her voice steady despite the bombshells she was dropping. "He was looking for someone to help him with what he called wife problems. His exact words were, 'I need Caroline to disappear, but it has to look natural.'" Rich sat motionless at the defense table, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was planning something. "We made it look like an accident," Veronica continued. "Caroline was standing on the balcony, crying about the baby. When I pushed her, Richard called 911 immediately, played the grieving husband perfectly." Sarah felt a sharp pain in her lower back, but forced herself to focus. This testimony was saving her life. "And Mrs. Chen Parker?" Marcus asked. "Same plan. Richard had been documenting her supposed mental illness for months, setting up the narrative. I was supposed to provoke her into doing something self-destructive, then help clean up the mess." The pain in Sarah's back intensified. She gripped the table, trying not to show distress, but Dr. Foster, who'd been observing from the gallery, noticed immediately. "But something changed," Marcus pressed. Veronica's voice faltered for the first time. "Richard got greedy. He started planning to frame me for everything. The Russian money, Caroline's murder, Sarah's planned death. He was going to make me the scapegoat while he disappeared with a new identity." Sarah gasped as another wave of pain hit. This wasn't stress. This was labor. "Mrs. Chen Parker," Judge Matthews said with concern, "are you all right?" Before Sarah could answer, 3 things happened in rapid succession, each one worse than the last. First, Rich's phone buzzed with a text message that made his face go white. He showed it to Blackstone, who immediately stood up. "Your Honor, we need an immediate recess. My client's safety has been compromised." "What do you mean?" Judge Matthews demanded. Blackstone looked genuinely terrified. "The Russian associates Mr. Richardson has been allegedly laundering money for have just issued a termination contract on everyone connected to this case." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Sarah felt another contraction, stronger this time, as she realized the implications. Rich's criminal partners had decided to eliminate all witnesses, including her. Second, as if summoned by the chaos, the courtroom doors burst open and federal agents flooded in, weapons drawn. "FBI!" Agent Sarah Collins shouted. "Nobody move." Rich tried to run, but was tackled by 2 agents before he reached the door. Sarah watched in shock as they cuffed him. "Richard Richardson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and racketeering." But even as relief flooded through Sarah, the third tragedy struck. Veronica, seeing the federal agents, made a desperate choice. She pulled a small pistol from her purse, pointing it directly at Sarah. "Nobody moves, or the pregnant lady dies," she screamed, her composed facade finally cracking completely. Sarah couldn't move anyway. The contractions were coming fast now, and she could feel something was seriously wrong. The baby wasn't moving normally. "Veronica," Rich called out from his position on the floor. "Don't be stupid. Kill her, and you're looking at death row." "Shut up!" Veronica shrieked. "This is all your fault. You promised me we'd disappear together, but you were planning to throw me away like all the others." Judge Matthews tried to maintain control. Miss Sterling, lower the weapon. We can work this out. No. Veronica's hand shook as she held the gun. I've killed for him. I've destroyed lives for him. And he was going to let me rot in prison while he started over. Sarah felt warm liquid between her legs and knew her water had broken. The baby was coming now, 3 weeks early, in the middle of a hostage situation. Dr. Foster tried to edge closer. Sarah needs medical attention immediately. She needs to die, Veronica screamed, just like Caroline, just like all of them. But as she pulled the trigger, something unexpected happened. Judge Matthews threw himself between the gun and Sarah, taking the bullet in his shoulder. As he fell, chaos erupted. Federal agents fired, Veronica dropped, and Sarah collapsed into full labor, screaming not just from physical pain but from the emotional trauma of watching violence explode around her unborn child. The 3 tragedies had struck in less than 10 minutes: the Russian hit contract, the FBI raid, and the shooting. Sarah's world had gone from tentative hope to absolute nightmare in the span of a few heartbeats. As paramedics rushed in and agents secured the scene, Sarah looked up at Judge Matthews, who was being treated for his gunshot wound. "Why?" she gasped between contractions. His answer, spoken through gritted teeth as medics worked on his shoulder, changed everything she thought she knew about her life. "Because you're my daughter, Sarah, and I've been watching over you for 28 years. The shared experience that would resonate with viewers was becoming clear. How many people had family they didn't know about, protection they'd never recognized, love they'd never understood. In the ambulance racing toward Mount Sinai Hospital, Judge Matthews explained everything while paramedics worked on both him and Sarah. "Your mother, Helen Chen, was my court reporter 29 years ago," he said, his voice strained from the gunshot wound. "We had an affair, she got pregnant, but my political career was just starting. A mixed-race relationship would have destroyed everything back then." Sarah gripped his uninjured hand as another contraction hit. "She never told me. She was protecting both of us. Made me promise to stay away until you turned 18. Then 18 became 21. Then she got sick and died before we could reconnect." The paramedic monitoring Sarah's vital signs looked concerned. "Heart rate's dropping. We need to get her to surgery fast." "The baby," Sarah gasped, distressed but fighting, like his mother. Judge Matthews squeezed her hand. "Helen left me a letter when she died. Said if you ever needed help, I'd know. When you walked into my courtroom, pregnant and desperate, I knew exactly who you were. But you couldn't help because of judicial ethics. Until today, the moment Veronica pulled that gun, judicial ethics went out the window. You're my daughter, and nobody threatens my family." At the hospital, Sarah was rushed into emergency surgery while Judge Matthews underwent treatment for his shoulder wound. The bullet had missed major arteries, but the symbolic impact was enormous. A sitting federal judge had taken a bullet to protect his secret daughter from her husband's criminal associates. Detective Lisa Rodriguez arrived at the hospital with updates that painted an even darker picture of Rich's operations. "The Russians confirmed the hit," she told Marcus and Dr. Foster in the waiting room. $5 million contract on everyone connected to the money laundering case. Sarah, the judge, Veronica, even you, Mr. Webb. Marcus paled. "How long do we have? FBI's arranging protective custody for everyone. But these people are patient. They'll wait months or years for the right opportunity." Dr. Foster shook her head. "Sarah can't give birth under this kind of stress. The baby's already in distress." 3 hours later, William David Parker was born via emergency C-section, weighing 5 pounds and fighting for every breath. Sarah held him for exactly 30 seconds before federal marshals took him to a secure wing of the hospital. "He's beautiful," Judge Matthews said from his wheelchair, his arm in a sling. "Helen would be so proud." Sarah was crying, but not from joy. Her baby was alive but immediately placed in federal protection. She'd survived Rich's murder plot only to discover that Russian assassins were now hunting her. Every victory seemed to come with an even worse defeat. The next week unfolded like a nightmare Sarah couldn't wake up from. Rich was held without bail, but his lawyers were already building an insanity defense. Veronica was in critical condition, and doctors weren't sure she'd survive to testify. Meanwhile, Sarah remained under federal protection in a safe house in Queens, separated from her newborn son, who was in FBI custody at an undisclosed location. "This isn't sustainable," Agent Collins explained during a briefing with Sarah's legal team. "The Russians have unlimited resources and patience. We can't protect you indefinitely." "What are my options?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Witness protection, new identity, new location, complete break from your former life." Sarah's heart broke. "What about my son?" "He'd come with you, of course, but Judge Matthews couldn't be part of your new life. Too recognizable." The cruelest irony was that she'd finally found her father, only to lose him again. Judge Matthews, recovering from his surgery, made an unprecedented decision. "I'm retiring from the bench immediately," he announced to the media. "My daughter needs me more than the court system does." The statement sent shockwaves through the legal community. Federal judges didn't retire in the middle of high-profile cases unless something extraordinary was happening. "Dad, you can't," Sarah protested when he visited her at the safe house. "Your career, your legacy." "My legacy is you," he replied firmly. "Helen made me promise to protect you if you ever needed it. I'm 28 years late, but I'm keeping that promise now." Meanwhile, Detective Rodriguez had been digging deeper into Rich's operation. What she found changed everything again. "The money laundering was just the surface," she explained to the gathered team. "Rich has been running a sophisticated operation targeting wealthy widows and divorced women. He and Veronica weren't just partners in crime. They were running a murder-for-hire business disguised as matchmaking." Marcus looked up from his legal briefs. "How many victims?" "We've identified 12 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, all wealthy women going through divorces or recently widowed. All had brief relationships with either Rich or men connected to his network." Sarah felt sick. "I was never special to him. I was just another mark." "A particularly valuable one," Rodriguez confirmed. "Your trust fund from your mother's life insurance made you worth $40 million. If you died in childbirth, he'd have inherited everything as widower and father." The scope of Rich's evil was beyond anything Sarah had imagined. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting to stop a killing machine that had been operating in plain sight for years. But the worst news was yet to come. Dr. Foster arrived at the safe house with an expression Sarah had learned to dread. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about William." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What's wrong with my baby?" "Nothing's wrong with him, but the DNA test the FBI ordered showed something unexpected." Sarah's world tilted. "He's not Rich's son." "No, he is Rich's biological child." "But Sarah," the test also revealed something else. "William has a rare genetic condition that will require specialized treatment for the rest of his life." The third tragedy in the devastating sequence was becoming clear. Even if Sarah survived the Russians, even if Rich went to prison, even if she got her son back, William would need medical care that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. "The condition is manageable," Dr. Foster continued quickly. But the treatment protocols are expensive and ongoing. Without Rich's financial support, Sarah understood immediately. She could save her son's life by staying married to his father, or she could save her own life by divorcing him. But she couldn't do both. Rich, even from his federal holding cell, had found a way to torture her with an impossible choice. That night, Sarah sat in her protected room, staring at photos of William on her phone. He was so small, so vulnerable, depending on machines to breathe while lawyers and agents debated his future. She'd thought finding her father and exposing Rich's crimes would be the end of her ordeal. Instead, it was just the beginning of an even more complex nightmare. The wisdom moment that would resonate with audiences was crystallizing. Sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing everything you thought you wanted. 2 weeks after the shooting, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. She walked into the federal detention center where Rich was being held and requested a face-to-face meeting. "You can't be serious," Agent Collins said. "He's already tried to have you killed twice. And he'll keep trying until this is finished." Sarah replied, "I need to end this on my terms." Marcus accompanied her, along with federal marshals and recording equipment. Rich looked terrible, his expensive suits replaced by orange jail scrubs, his confidence shattered by isolation and the reality of facing life in prison. "Hello, darling," he said as Sarah sat across from him in the visitor's room. "You look well for someone who should be dead by now." "The Russians called off the hit," Sarah said calmly. "Turns out they don't like partners who draw federal attention to their operations. You're persona non grata in the criminal world now." Rich's mask slipped. "What do you want?" "William's medical trust fund. Full access, no strings attached." "In exchange for what?" Sarah leaned forward. "I'm going to tell you something, Rich. Something that will save your pathetic life." Rich's eyebrows rose, the first genuine surprise she'd seen from him. "Veronica didn't just record your conversations about killing me. She recorded everything. Every murder, every money transfer, every conversation with your Russian friends. 12 women. Rich. 12 families destroyed." Rich's face went white. "That's impossible." "She's been playing you from day one, the same way you thought you were playing me. The FBI has everything now. Every crime you've committed in the past 5 years." Sarah stood to leave, then turned back. "Oh, and Rich. The photos you used to frame me, Veronica created those too. Months before we even started divorce proceedings. She's been setting you up to take the fall for everything while she disappears with a new identity." Rich's composure finally shattered completely. "You're lying. MI ask Agent Collins about the Swiss bank account Veronica opened in your name, the one with evidence of every murder you commissioned." As Sarah walked away, she heard Rich screaming behind her, finally understanding that he'd been outplayed by someone even more ruthless than himself. The final confrontation came a month later in federal court. Rich, facing multiple death penalty charges, agreed to transfer all assets to William's medical trust in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Veronica, paralyzed from the waist down but very much alive, received 25 years for cooperation in exposing the broader criminal network. Judge Matthews had recovered fully and was indeed retiring to help raise his grandson. Sarah moved into a secure apartment in Brooklyn, finally able to hold William without federal supervision. "You know what the strangest part is," Sarah said to Dr. Foster during one of their sessions. "I actually feel grateful." "Grateful?" "Rich tried to destroy me, but instead he led me to my real family. He tried to isolate me, but instead he forced me to find my own strength. Even the horrible things brought me to where I needed to be. 6 months later, Sarah testified before Congress about domestic financial abuse, her story helping pass legislation that would protect other women from similar traps. The Helen Chen Foundation, named for her mother, had already helped hundreds of women escape dangerous relationships. Rich died in federal prison 2 years later, stabbed by another inmate whose daughter had been one of his victims. Sarah felt nothing when she heard the news. Not relief, not sadness. Just the quiet satisfaction of a chapter finally closed. On William's 2nd birthday, Sarah stood in their apartment watching him play with building blocks while Judge Matthews read him stories. Her phone buzzed with a message from a woman in California who'd escaped her abusive marriage after watching Sarah's testimony. "Thank you for showing me that survival is possible." Sarah smiled, watching her son stack blocks with determined concentration. He was healthy now, his medical condition manageable thanks to the trust fund that Rich's crimes had ultimately provided. "You know what I learned?" she said to her father as William climbed into his lap. "What's that?" "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing. Rich thought he was destroying me, but he was just clearing away everything that wasn't really me, everything that wasn't strong enough to survive." Judge Matthews hugged his grandson, then looked at his daughter with pride. "Your mother always said you had an unbreakable core. I'm glad she was right." Outside their window, the city hummed with 8 million stories of struggle and survival. Sarah's was just one of them, but it was hers. And she'd fought for every moment of the happiness she'd found on the other side of terror. The baby who'd nearly been orphaned before birth was building towers with his grandfather, protected by a mother who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life can inadvertently become the catalyst for finding your true family. Rich had tried to write Sarah's ending, but she'd taken the pen and written her own beginning instead.